On the edge of the city, lost among the ominous shadows and eternal gloom, stood an abandoned cemetery. Old gravestones were covered with the sands of time, and crosses and monuments were covered with wood mold. This place, full of forgotten stories and lost souls, seemed doomed to oblivion. However, fate subtly wove the threads of events, preparing to reveal the dark secrets of the cemetery. It all began one gloomy night, when the blood moon lit up over the city. The wind whispered its unspoken stories, and the night crows carched curses. That night, a group of young explorers decided to investigate the cemetery. They were interested in a legend that told of a terrifying curse that supposedly ruled the place. At the head of the group was Daniel, an ambitious and fearless guy who never believed in the supernatural. His companions were also fascinated by mystical mysteries: Emma, a young paranormal researcher; Mark, a brave and humorous guy; Michelle, a girl with an unruly character; and Tom, a scientist who investigates occult phenomena. The group gathered at the cemetery gate, looking around the dark alleys and muffled sounds of the night. Daniel chuckled, trying to dispel the tension, and they entered the darkness. With each step forward, the atmosphere became more unbearable. Emma noticed Michelle's hands trembling, and Mark seemed to be teasing fear. As they passed by rows of old graves, the group noticed a strange glow in the distance. They moved in its direction, and soon found the source. It was an ancient mausoleum, tall and gloomy, as if drawing them into its embrace. As they got closer, they noticed that the door of the mausoleum was ajar. A sudden sensation of coldness awaited them on the threshold, as if an invisible hand had passed over their backs. But their curiosity was stronger than fear, and they stepped inside. Inside, there was an atmosphere of horror and oblivion. The walls were covered with dust and cobwebs, and the air was saturated with the smell of death. In the very center of the mausoleum stood a coffin covered with a black blanket. Daniel strode determinedly over to it and lifted the blanket. Inside lay a body, but not just any body. It was suddenly a reverse copy of Daniel's. The shocked group realized that they had encountered something far more sinister than just a curse. Before them stood the doppelganger, an ancient spirit capable of materializing in the form of the living. Emma glanced at the doppelganger's mirrored eyes and realized they were playing with fire. The ancient spirit began to emit streams of darkness, making their hearts clench with terror. Tom tried to count out a chanted prayer, but his voice fell silent, as if swallowed up by an invisible force. Michelle tried to run away, but her legs wouldn't obey her and she fell to the floor. Daniel clenched his fists, cursing the moment they had decided to explore the cemetery. Suddenly, with a silent creak, the mausoleum door closed behind them. They were locked inside with the ominous doppelganger. The dark figure began to approach, and their gazes began to dim with terror. At the last moment before the doppelganger touched Mark, the air began to fill with an ominous light. Emma realized it was her last chance and screamed, activating her artifact, a ball of light that dispelled the darkness. Suddenly, the mausoleum began to shake, and the ground shook. The ancient spirit let out a roar, as if suffering from the light, and disappeared. The door of the mausoleum slowly opened, and the group ran outside, breathing in terror and relief. They had not investigated any more supernatural phenomena since then, but their minds were filled with nightmares about the graveyard and the ancient doppelganger. After all, even in the darkest and most forgotten corners of the world, there are terrifying forces that are best not disturbed. On the outskirts of town stood an old and abandoned cemetery, surrounded by a high fence and shrouded in mystery. Here, among the old graves and the gloomy stone angels, there lurked a story that for years had attracted the attention of those who dared to take risks. The main character in this story was Jake, the cemetery guard, a man with deep eyes and a grim reputation. He never revealed his thoughts and always made sure that the night guards of this dreadful place were executed with unyielding strictness. The night in the cemetery was particularly eerie. Clouds hid the moon, and only faint patches of light shone through the foliage of the trees. Jake, cursing his work, watched every corner and distant rustle closely. There was something strange about this night, as if the air itself were saturated with bad omens. With every step Jake took, the feeling came over him that someone, invisible to his eyes, was watching him. His heart raced, and he tried to reason with himself this was just a cemetery, a place for the dead. But the fear that lived in his eyes was impossible to deny. Suddenly, through the fog, he saw a shadow. A shadow standing by one of the old graves. Jake tensed and stepped closer, his hand holding the flashlight, which began to shake in his trembling hands. As he illuminated the spot, his breath caught. Before him stood a figure clad in a black dress, with long dark hair covering her face. It was a woman, but not a living one. Her eyes were empty and cold, as if she had no soul. Jake tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The woman began to approach, her footsteps silent, as if she were hovering above the ground. Jake stepped back, then turned and ran, cursing his stupidity and wanting to get as far away from him as possible. But the faster he ran, the brighter the figure of the woman glowed ahead. He darted among the graves, his eyes darting about, and he felt that she was following him, not letting him get away. At one point he found himself at a dead end. He was standing in front of an old stone grave, from which rose a statue of an angel. Jake recoiled, his breathing ragged, and he looked up at the statue. His heart almost stopped. The angel statue was moving. Its stone eyes were watching Jake, and its marble face exuded a coldness that penetrated right into his soul. Jake tried to move, but his feet felt as if they were glued to the ground. The statue stepped forward slowly, its marble hand rising and pointing at Jake. He experienced a horror he couldn't describe in words. He tried to make a sound, but his throat was tightened by the iron grip of fear. And then, as if from the depths of hell, there came a scream. The scream was piercing and agonizing, and it tore through the night in the cemetery. The angel statue froze, and the woman's figure vanished as if she had vanished into thin air. Jake collapsed to the ground, his heart pounding frantically and his breathing uncontrollable. He stared at the statue, which stood motionless again, as if nothing had happened. But the ghostly images of the woman in black and the angel with the marble face lived in his eyes for a long time. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight illuminated the cemetery, Jake sat on an old stone, his eyes tired and faded. It seemed to him that the night would never end, that he remained a prisoner between the world of the living and the world of the dead. From then on he never saw that woman in black again, nor did he meet the angel. But the statue remained in its place, as if it watched over everyone who set foot on that cursed piece of land. The story of Jake and his night in the cemetery became a legend, retold to each other in the evenings around the campfire. But no one knew that the truth lurked in the shadows of the graves, that there was a thin line between worlds that was best never crossed. The small town of Suntville seemed like a peaceful and cozy place where time flowed slowly, like forgotten milk on a stove. But behind its beautiful facades and friendly residents lurked a dark secret that shattered one family's life. The Morgan family lived in an old house on the edge of town. John and Emily Morgan raised two children, 9-year-old Tommy and 14-year-old Elizabeth. Life seemed perfect, a beautiful home, loving parents, their little world was full of joy and hope. One day, in late fall, the Morgan family went for a walk in the neighborhood. They planned to spend the weekend outdoors, enjoying the last warm days before winter set in. The sun was touching the leafy trees with its golden rays, and the wind was whispering its gentle melodies. The family had chosen an old cemetery in the woods as their resting place. Their route took them past the cemetery, and despite the dusk beginning to fall, the children asked to stop and see the atmospheric place. John and Emily agreed, and they entered the cemetery grounds. Here, among the old graves and ruins, there was a special peace and quiet. Elizabeth took pictures of the lichen-strewn stones, and Tommy ran merrily between them, playing hide-and-seek. When it was time to go home, the family started heading back. but somehow they couldn't find their way out of the forest. The path that had seemed so easy suddenly disappeared, as if an impenetrable veil of fog had surrounded them. John tried to use the compass, but the arrow started spinning strangely, pointing in all directions. Emily tried to make a phone call, but the network disappeared and she couldn't reach anyone. The family continued walking, hoping to find a way out. But the further they walked, the thicker the fog became, and the road seemed endless. Finally, they decided to return to the cemetery and try to find another way out. When they returned to the cemetery, they noticed that the graves and stones looked different. It was as if the place itself was changing its appearance. They sensed that something was wrong, that the cemetery was no longer the place they had seen before. Suddenly, shadows began to emerge from the fog. Shadows that looked like people, yet were distorted and horrible. The Morgan family shuddered, their hearts beat faster, and their eyes reflected incredible terror. The shadows began to approach. They walked slowly and steadily. John and Emily tried to back away, but their feet were glued to the ground. Tommy and Elizabeth screamed with fear, their voices tearing through the night, but there was no help. The shadows drew closer and closer, and the Morgan family realized that they would not be able to escape this nightmare. Suddenly, a female figure emerged from behind the fog. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes glittered with madness. She approached the family, and their fear peaked. "Welcome to my world," she whispered, and at that moment the Morgan family disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, locals came to the cemetery looking for the missing people. They found their cell phones, but could find no trace of the Morgan family. Even the cemetery seemed different, dark and ominous. The Morgan family was reported missing. A heavy silence enveloped the town, and residents began to avoid the cemetery. No one knew what had happened to the family, and no one dared to go to the cemetery after sunset. The story of the Morgan family remained unsolved. The mystery of the cemetery consumed them, as if they had become part of dark stories and were forever in a world of shadows and horrors. From then on, the cemetery in Suntville became a place of terrible legends, and no one dared approach it after sunset.